Amen. So we're continuing our study through the kings, and particularly we're going through the northern kingdom of Israel. And so we have where we had the split from Solomon, where after he died, we had Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He took over the northern kingdom with 10 tribes up there. And then we had Rehoboam that took the southern kingdom of Judah. And what we're getting into now is after Jeroboam. But I first want you to see, and I don't know if I mentioned it, how long Jeroboam reigned for. But go to 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 20, and we're actually going to cover Nadab, Baasha, and Elah. So I'm combining some of these because there's just not a lot of information about some of these kings, and they only reigned for a little bit. I'm going to be hitting Nadab, which is Jeroboam's son, and then Baasha, and then Elah, which is Baasha's son. And so some of these are going to be combined. Well, when we're in the kings of Judah, those will pretty much be all their own sermon because there's a lot more information about them. But in 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 20, it says, "In the days which Jeroboam reigned were 22 years, and he slept with his fathers, and Nadab his son reigned in his stead." So Nadab is the next one on the list. Now, so I'm just going to give you the years that these guys reigned. So Jeroboam reigns for 22 years. Then his son, Nadab, is going to reign 2 years after that. Baasha is going to reign for 24 years, and then his son, Elah, is going to reign for 2 years. And so I'm going to just tell you straight up, Jeroboam, he sins that great sin, and therefore there's a judgment that's pronounced against him, and all his sons are going to end up dying, and Nadab only reigns for 2 years, and that happens. Baasha does the same exact thing as Jeroboam, and then his son only reigns for 2 years, and the same thing happens. So it's pretty much history repeating itself with these two guys. So Jeroboam and Baasha are very similar in the fact of what goes on there. But we see Nadab being brought up here in 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 25. And the thing that you have to think about, too, is that when you're reading through here, we read about Asa and all that stuff, and it'll go all the way to where Jehoshaphat's reigning. And then when you get to Nadab, we're going way back. We're going back further than that. So that's why it's a little confusing when you're reading through the Kings, because it'll basically tell this kind of whole story, and then it'll be like, all right, well, Nadab started to reign in the second year of Asa. It's like, wait a minute, I thought Asa just died. But that's why it's a little more confusing. You got to almost look at this as just thinking about when you're reading through here, I'm reading about Judah and all this stuff. But then you have these other, the kings of Israel are mixed in there as far as there's things that are said about them during Asa's reign before we even get to Baasha. Right? Before we even see Baasha reigning, we see him and Asa having something going on there. And so it does get a little confusing with that. So that's the whole purpose of this series, is to kind of just, focus in on, okay, what about Baasha? What about, his son Elah? And going down that line and kind of just, seeing all the pieces and how they fit together. So in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 25, it says, "And Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah. And he reigned over Israel 2 years." Now, the thing to think about here, too, is that when Nadab, which is the son of Jeroboam, begins to reign, there's already been 2 kings of Judah that have come and gone, Rehoboam and Abijam. And Rehoboam reigns for 17 years, and then his son only reigns for 3 years. And Jeroboam's still reigning when Asa starts. Okay, so Jeroboam's going on for 3 kings of Judah, and then he dies at the very beginning of Asa's reign. And then we'll see it kind of switch, because then Asa is going to be reigning all the way up, like all these kings that we're going to be mentioning, Nadab, Baasha, and Elah, like Asa's reigning through all that. So it kind of switches on who's kind of staying the king in one area, and then they're going through all these different changes. And so, again, I want to make a chart because you'll see that clearly, right? You'll see this big chunk where it's Jeroboam, and then you'll see these other kings that are kind of falling in line. Then you'll see this big chunk of Asa, and then you'll see these other kings falling in line as far as how they fit together. So, but you can get that from reading it, but you got to think about it and kind of visualize it. But he reigns for 2 years over Israel, and it says in verse 26, it says, "And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. And Baasha, the son of Ahijah, of the house of Issachar, conspired against him, and Baasha smote him at Gibbethon, which belongeth to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel laid siege to Gibbethon. Even in the 3rd year of Asa king of Judah did Baasha slay him, and reigned in his stead. And it came to pass, when he reigned, that he smote all the house of Jeroboam. He left not to Jeroboam any that breathed, until he had destroyed him, according unto the saying of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite, because of the sins of Jeroboam which he sinned, and which he made Israel to sin by his provocation, wherewith he provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So we really see not a lot mentioned about Nadab. It's pretty much he reigns for 2 years and then he's taken out by Baasha, right? But the one thing that I want you to see here is the sins of the fathers visiting, or the iniquity of the fathers visiting their children. And this is something that God has told us, in Exodus chapter 20. Go to Exodus chapter 20. And it's something that you keep seeing, and you say, well, why are you bringing this up? Well, because Jeroboam's sin keeps being brought up over and over and over and over again as we go down through this line where it says they walked in the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And it'll be like hundreds of years later, and they're walking in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And so this is something that's very true. It's interesting that even when this is brought up about how God's going to visit the iniquity of the children and all of the fathers on the children, how it's dealing with graven images and idols. And that is the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, is he made 2 golden calves. He put one in Dan and one in Bethel, and they were worshiping these idols, right? So in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3, you have the first commandment, which is thou shalt have no other gods before me. But then you have the graven image, worshiping idols, and the second commandment, which is verse 4 there. It says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. So this is one of the 10 commandments. The second commandment, which is not to make idols and not to worship idols, right? And it's saying that if they do that, he's going to visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children. And the thing that's interesting about this is that we see this happening, right? They keep repeating themselves. But Nadab also sinned too, okay? Now go to Deuteronomy chapter 24. Deuteronomy chapter 24. Because I do believe that if someone sins, a whole nation can suffer because of that, even if they didn't commit that sin, meaning the consequences of, for example, the consequences of our country going to war with, and innocent people dying or something like that. You as a person didn't really ask for that, and you may be trying to live your life in a righteous way, but you get sucked into it, so to speak. And so the northern kingdom of Israel gets sucked into all that because of their leaders, but also you have the fact that the Bible does say that the children are not to be put to death for the sins of their fathers. Okay, meaning that if their father commits a sin, they are not to get the death penalty for their father's sin, and vice versa with the children, right? So in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 16, it says, the fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. And so what it comes down to is that in all these cases, it's interesting because Nadab actually sins just as much as his father Jeroboam. And if you remember the story, and I'm not going into the story about the child that dies, right? But it's the whole prophecy of how they were going to be taken out is that if they were in the city, they're going to be eaten by dogs, and if they're in the field, they're going to be eaten by fowl. But the child was going to be buried because he found what? Some good thing in him from the Lord. That tells me is that the rest of his sons were as evil as Jeroboam, as sinful as Jeroboam. But notice in 1 Kings chapter 14, 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 7 there, it says, go tell Jeroboam, thus saith the Lord God of Israel, for as much as I exalted thee from among the people, and made thee prince over my people, and rent the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it thee. Yet thou hast not been as my servant David, who kept my commandments, who followed with me with all his heart, and to do that only which was right in mine eyes. But hast done evil above all that were before thee. For thou hast gone and made thee other gods and molten images to provoke me to anger, and hast cast me behind thy back. Therefore, behold, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel, and will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam, as a man taketh away dung, till it be all gone. Him that dieth of Jeroboam in the city shall the dogs eat, and him that dieth in the field shall the fowls of the air eat, for the Lord hath spoken it. And what I see here, honestly, is where, you remember, Jeroboam had the choice to follow the Lord. And he said, if you follow me, you'll have prosperity. And with God, it's either you follow his commandments and you have a blessing, or you don't follow his commandments and you're going to have a curse. It's really that black and white. And go to Deuteronomy chapter 11. And every single one of these kings has a choice. And what it comes down to with both Nadab and Elah, we'll see, which are the sons that are basically taken out early, what we see is that they sin as well, and they had the choice. And you can't blame God for knowing the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, knowing that he pronounced this judgment, knowing that Nadab would do the same sins that Jeroboam did, and he's going to pronounce the same judgment against Baasha and his children, knowing that Elah was going to do the same thing as him. And so you say, well, what if, what if Elah wasn't bad? What if he would have been like doing right in the eyes of the Lord? Then God wouldn't have made that pronouncement of judgment on all the house of Baasha. You can't say this hypothetical what if, because you're making up stuff that God's, you got to put God in the equation to say whether he would even make that pronouncement if he knew that they would follow the Lord. It's kind of like Josiah. Josiah, turned the tides a little bit for a little while anyway, because after Manasseh, he said, you're going down. But then Josiah comes in, and he has a tender heart, and God says, I'm not going to do it in your day. And so he could have done the same thing with both Nadab, and he could have done the same thing with Elah, meaning that he could have pronounced this judgment, meaning that eventually Jeroboam, all his house is going to be completely gone. But maybe not in Nadab's day, and maybe not in Elah's day, if they would have followed the Lord. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 26, it says, Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. A blessing if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if you will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day, to go after other gods which ye have not known. And so notice how it's black and white with God. Heaven, hell, blessing, cursing, life, death. It's always black and white. And he's saying, I'm setting before you a blessing and a cursing. Follow my commandments, and you'll have a blessing. And if you disobey my commandments, then you're going to have a curse. And so those are extremes. You're saying, you guys are so extreme. Yeah, because God's extreme. And, Deuteronomy 28, you could turn there as well, because Deuteronomy 28 really kind of turns that up a little bit, where he's setting before you a blessing and a curse, and then he's going to give you the blessings and the cursings that you're going to have, whether you do them or not. And notice how it's just equal on both sides. And I'm actually writing a sermon for Wednesday dealing with the tokens of God, and how there's two sides to every coin, and how you have this case where it's basically two extremes, though. But it's kind of like, life, death, that's two extremes, but they're both equally, opposite of each other. Same thing with the blessing and the curses. And what's interesting is that the same things that are being said about how he's going to bless you is the same thing he's going to say about how he's going to curse you. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and verse 1 it says, And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. Blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shalt thou be in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of thy womb, or the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy ground, and the fruit of thy cattle, the increase of thy kine, and the flocks of thy sheep. Blessed shall be thy basket and thy store. Blessed shalt blessed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and blessed shalt thou be when thou goest out. So notice, all these blessings and everything. Well, go down to verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. Cursed shalt thou be in the city, and cursed shalt thou be in the field. Cursed shall be thy basket and thy store. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy kind, and the flocks of thy sheep. Cursed shalt thou be when thou comest in, and cursed shalt thou be when thou goest out. Notice how it's the same things that are being said, but notice that I've set before you a blessing and a cursing, and God is not wanting to curse us. He wants us to be blessed. He wants us to choose Him, but He's saying, listen, I've set this before you. Choose life. It says in another place, because you have free will. And Nadab had the choice to choose life. Nadab had the choice to, don't get this idea that, our fathers did this, and I'm just suffering the consequences of the iniquities of the fathers. No, you have free choice, and you could be a Josiah. You could turn the tides, and you can stay the hand of God's judgment. That doesn't mean it's not going to come eventually, but why don't you stay that hand of judgment, and in your day it won't be a curse, it'll be a blessing. And so, this whole idea, God is pronouncing His judgment. Yeah, first of all, He already knows that Nadab's going to make that choice. But, if Nadab would have taken the free choice to serve God, guess what? That judgment wouldn't even have been there. And, or God would say, well, you know what? I'm not going to do it to you, Nadab. I'm going to do it to your children, because they're going to end up following, Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And so you don't want to read through these passages and be like, well, they were kind of doomed, from the beginning. You're kind of starting off on that bad foot, God's cursing them. Well, you got to understand that God probably already saw that Nadab was wicked. And, when that child came, all of those children, that were older who knows how old Nadab was, when he began to reign. So he could have been an adult when this judgment was even given, meaning he was already doing exactly like Papa. And so, but anyway, I want you to just think about that for a second as far as Nadab. But there's not that much about Nadab, right? It's just kind of like he reigns for 2 years, and then Baasha takes him out. And, Baasha, was basically working with him and all that stuff. And it's interesting because you always see these conspiracies. There's a lot of conspiracies with the kings of Israel. And it's always like a servant, that goes rogue on you. And we'll see the same thing with Elah. Elah's going to be taken out by one of his servants. And Jeroboam was a servant of Solomon. All these different things about conspiring and people that are in, that are close to you. But in 1 Kings chapter 15 verse 27, we see Baasha, who he is. It says, and Baasha the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar. And so it says, conspired against him, talking about Nadab, and Baasha smote him at Gibbethon, which belongeth to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel laid siege to Gibbethon. So you may wonder when you're reading through this is, because Ahijah the prophet is mentioned in here. You may ask yourself, well, is he Ahijah the prophet's son, Baasha? I don't believe so, and here's why. It says that he's Baasha the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar. But when you get to Ahijah the prophet, notice in verse 29 there, when talking about Ahijah the prophet, it says, and it came to pass when he reigned that he smote all the house of Jeroboam. He left not to Jeroboam any that breathed until he had destroyed him, according unto the saying of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. So Issachar, and you may say, well, where is a Shilonite? Well, Shiloh is a place or a city, so it's not a tribe, right? If you remember, Shiloh is where the first tabernacle was set up. So Eli the prophet and Samuel, they were in Shiloh. And now Shiloh is also a name that's given to the Lord Jesus Christ. And Genesis chapter 49 talks about until Shiloh come. but Shiloh is a place as well. So Shiloh, what I'm going to show you is that Shiloh is actually in Ephraim. Okay, so here's a little geography lesson. And I just kind of want to prove this, that Baasha is not the son of Ahijah the prophet. Because that would be kind of strange, wouldn't it? That this prophet's son is like killing, Elah, and then there's going to be this same prophet's going to give a judgment against Baasha. But it is that his dad's name is Ahijah. But what you see in the Bible a lot of times is there's a lot of repeats in names. And even Moses, you probably read the place where it says, this is that Moses and Aaron that, did these miracles and all this stuff. And I'm kind of like, well, where's the other Moses? It's not mentioned in the Bible, right? But they made a point to say, this is that Moses, that was of Amram, and Jochebed, or, however, I forget exactly how it says in the Old Testament. But basically, it'll say, here's their parents, here's their lineage, because, this is that Moses. So there was obviously another Moses somewhere in history. So even Moses' name was repeated somewhere. But notice go to Judges chapter 4. Judges chapter 4. What we'll see is that Shiloh is north of Bethel. Actually, I'm going to go to Judges 21 first. So I'm going to show you where it says Shiloh's at. Okay, so the Bible does state where Shiloh's at. It's going to be between two other cities, but you're going to say, well, where are they at? Okay, what tribe are they in? So my whole point is that Baasha is of Issachar, and then Ahijah the prophet, I'm going to show you, is from Ephraim. Okay, so that shows you that they're not father-son, because that wouldn't make sense, if you're an Ephraimite and anyway. So you say, why you bring this up? I don't know. I think it's interesting. And sometimes when I read through this, I want to make sure that I'm looking at this right and that there's no correlation between Ahijah the prophet and Baasha, the son of Ahijah, right? And so in Judges 21 and verse 19, it says, then they said, behold, there is a feast of the Lord in Shiloh, yearly in a place which is on the north side of Bethel, and on the east side of the highway that goeth up from Bethel to Shechem, and on the south of Lebanon. So it's north of Bethel, and it's east of this highway that goes from Bethel to Shechem. So imagine, you kind of think about I-79, right? Think about Grafton. If you're going from Clarksburg up to Morgantown, right? There's a highway from Clarksburg to Morgantown, and Grafton is east of that highway. Does that make sense? You just kind of see the way it's kind of picturing this. There's this road that's going south to north, or north to south, however you're going there. And Shiloh would be east of Bethel and Shechem, and it's east of that highway that goes between those two places, okay? And you say, well, okay, what's your point? Well, both Shechem and Bethel are both in Ephraim, in Mount Ephraim, okay? So go to Judges chapter 4. Judges chapter 4 and verse 5. Say, Pastor, I'm just still trying to figure out whether the Israel's in the north or Judah's in the south. I understand, that the geography is hard when you're not picturing it, and it would help if we had like a map. But honestly, I don't trust any of the maps that are out there. When you look at these maps online and they have like the different boundaries and stuff like that, I think that you can basically put a general idea of where these places are at on a map. But, a lot of these maps, they're completely different. You'll look at this one and it'd be like Simeon's over here, and then Simeon's in the center of Judah, and then, there'd be like completely different. I'm like, how in the world do you get that far difference in your estimates there? But anyway, in Judges chapter 4 and verse 5, it says, and she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel and Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So Bethel in Mount Ephraim. Okay, so Bethel, obviously, is the house, the house of God. That's where one of those golden calves was at, right? And Dan was the other place. So Dan obviously is in Dan. Okay, but Bethel is in Ephraim. And now go to Joshua chapter 20 and verse 7. Joshua chapter 20 and verse 7. Joshua chapter 20 and verse 7. It says, and they appointed Kedesh and Galilee and and Mount Naphtali, and Shechem and Mount Ephraim, and Kirjath Arba, which is Hebron, and the mountain of Judah. Actually, there's a lot of information you can find just from this one verse right here on geography, because Galilee is in Naphtali. That's why when you're in the New Testament, it says Zebulun and Naphtali, Galilee of the nations. You know, in the New Testament it says that, so you know where Galilee's at. It's up at where Naphtali's at. And then you see Shechem's in Ephraim, but you also see that Kirjath Arba, which is Hebron, is in Judah, which makes sense because David reigned in Hebron for how many years? 7.5 years. So that makes sense that Hebron's in Judah. So anyway, all that to say is that, okay, well, Bethel's in Ephraim, Shechem's in Ephraim, and Shiloh is on the east side between those two. So what do you have? They're all in Mount Ephraim, okay? And so Shiloh is in Ephraim, so it's, you know, that Ahijah's from Ephraim, okay? And you say, well, what was the whole point of that? Ahijah the prophet is not the father of Baasha. That's what I wanted to get to. Okay, so, but those are just little details I like to look at when I'm going through here to see, okay, you know, kind of knock that off the list that that's not a part of this or something like that. Sometimes these people are related, and you're like, that's interesting, and how that works. So, but Baasha, again, Baasha reigns for 24 years, and again, this is where it gets interesting because Baasha is not really brought up until later on, but in chapter 15, when we're talking about Asa, Baasha is brought into the picture, okay, before we even start talking about Nadab. And so in chapter 15, so 1 Kings chapter 15 and verse 16, what we see is that Baasha tries to build Ramah, okay, and Ramah is in Ephraim, okay, so we actually already saw that in our little geography lesson there. But Ramah, he's trying to build this Ramah because basically what he wants to do is make it to where no one can go south. I mean, they are so paranoid in the north that people are going to go south and do sacrifices in Jerusalem and just become part of that southern kingdom, right? They're just really paranoid about this. And so this is what Baasha is trying to build Ramah, and Asa nips it in the bud. Okay, so notice the story here in verse 16. It says, and there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. And Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might not suffer any to go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. So notice that's why he's building this place. He's basically just trying to make it to where no one can come in or out of those two nations, kind of like a big wall between them. And verse 18, it says, then Asa took all the silver and the gold that were left in the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and delivered them into the hand of his servants. And King Asa sent them to Ben-Hadad, the son of Tabrimon, man, I can't pronounce that, Tabrimon, the son of Hezion, king of Syria, that dwelt at Damascus, saying, there is a league between me and thee, and between my father and thy father. Behold, I have sent unto thee a present of silver and gold. Come and break thy league with Baasha, king of Israel, that he may depart from me. So Ben-Hadad hearkened unto King Asa, and sent the captains of the host which he had against the cities of Israel, and smote Ijon and Dan, and Abel Beth-Maacah, and all Cinneroth, with all the land of Naphtali. And it came to pass, when Baasha heard thereof, that he left off building of Ramah, and built in Tirzah. Then King Asa made a proclamation throughout all Judah, none was exempted, and they took away the stones of Ramah and the timber thereof, wherewith Baasha had builded, and King Asa built with them Geba, Benjamin, and Mizpah. Okay, so what's going on here? So basically, imagine that you have Israel that's up here in the north. Dan is the northern portion of that, and then you have Ephraim, which is the lower portion of that southern kingdom. I'm sorry, the northern kingdom. I'm really going to confuse you guys. So the northern kingdom, right? Dan is the northern portion of the northern kingdom, and then Ephraim is the southern portion of that northern kingdom. And Ramah is right at the bottom of that. Does that make sense? And what he's trying to do is basically build this city to where no one can come down to Jerusalem to worship and to be a part of King Asa's kingdom, right? And he's building this fortress or whatever he's trying to do in Ramah. And this is what King Asa does. He gets Syria, who's above in the north, he makes a league. He says, break your league with Baasha, king of Israel, and make a league with me. And he gave him all the money out of the house of God. And I'm not saying this was right, okay? We haven't got the king Asa or anything like that. But he takes all the money out of the king's house and all this stuff and out of the house of God, and he gives it to Ben-Hadad. And what he does is he makes it a two-front battle. Basically, in the north, now Syria is coming down and taking out Ijon and Dan. So Dan is in the north, right? From Dan to Beersheba. So Dan's in the north, and Syria is coming in. So he's building down here, and he's like, oh, man, I got to get back up to the north to take care of this because I'm getting invaded. Does that make sense? And he leaves off, building of Ramah because he's got to go take care of his north border. And that's where Asa comes in and tears down all of Ramah and builds actually a place in Benjamin. So if you were looking at a map, what you'd see is Ephraim and Benjamin are butting up together, and actually Jerusalem's actually in the southern portion of Benjamin, which then goes into Judah. So Benjamin's a part of Judah, okay? And that's where this story takes place, is that basically Asa's like, no, I'm not having that. He makes a league with the king of Syria and gets basically King Baasha off his back of his northern border, okay? So that's kind of what's going on with that. Sometimes when you're reading through this, you're kind of like, what in the world's going on? But you got to visualize why that would be a big deal that Syria is coming in, because now you've got two fronts. You probably have heard of the, in the World War II, you had the Battle of the Bulge and all that stuff with Germany. So you had Britain, and obviously America was in there, coming in from Normandy and Normandy Beach and all that stuff, and kind of coming after Germany. Well, what happened was then when we made a league with Russia, what that happened? It was a two-front war. The reason that Germany made a league with Japan is they wanted another front war. They wanted basically Russia to have a two-front war. And didn't work out very well for them. But that's kind of the tactic behind the warfare there. So, but we see that he dwelt in Tirzah. So he left off building a Ramah, and he built Tirzah, and Tirzah is going to be the capital from that point until we get into Ahab, pretty much. Tirzah is going to burn down and all that. So we see that Shechem is where Jeroboam. Shechem is where? Ephraim. And then Tirzah, is the place that Baasha sets up the capital, at least until his son's taken out, and then you have all this other stuff with Zimri and Omri. Okay, so Tirzah is kind of that capital. But we see that Baasha follows in the steps of Jeroboam. So again, this is going to be the same song as we go through these kings, as far as them following after that. Notice in verse 32 of chapter 15. Verse 32 of chapter 15, it says, and there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. In the third year of Asa, king of Judah, began Baasha, the son of Ahijah, to reign over all Israel in Tirzah 24 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam and his sin, wherewith he made Israel to sin. And what we see is that same curse that was put upon Jeroboam and his children are put upon Baasha and his children. Go to 1 Kings chapter 16. So it's just history repeating itself. It's interesting because even their reigns are very similar. You have Jeroboam reigning for 22 years, then his son Nadab reigns for 2 years and dies. Then you have Baasha reigning for 24 years. He got 2 more years out of that. Reigns for 24 years, and then his son Elah is going to die after 2 years. So it's just history repeating itself over and over again. And in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 1, it says, the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha. So now we have a different prophet. So we had Ahijah before that. We had Ahijah that was pronouncing this judgment against Jeroboam. But now we have Jehu, the son of Hanani. Now, you may remember Jehu, the son of Hanani, by one of the verses that we quote a lot, dealing with the fact that we shouldn't love everybody. Because Jehu, the son of Hanani, is the prophet that said, shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore is wrath upon them before the Lord. That's in 2 Chronicles chapter 19. Talking to Jehoshaphat. Okay? And so it makes sense that Jehu, the son of Hanani, is here. Now, don't get Jehu, the son of Hanani, mixed up with Jehu, the son of Nimshi. Jehu, the son of Hanani, is the prophet that said, shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore is wrath upon them before the Lord. That's in 2 Chronicles chapter 19. Talking to Jehoshaphat. Okay? And so it makes sense that Jehu, the son of Hanani, is here. Now, don't get Jehu, the son of Nimshi Okay? So here's a prophet. Jehu, the son of Hanani, is a prophet. Jehu, the son of Nimshi, is going to be a king of Israel. Okay? So again, when we go through this, you really got to see the son of who, to kind of figure out who you're talking about. Because if you say Jehu, you could be talking about two different people. When you look at Azariah, you could be talking about a king, or you could be talking about a prophet or a priest. And so Zechariah, there's a king that's both a prophet and a priest there too, when we go through the kings of Israel. And so, but Jehu, the son of Hanani, is a prophet, not a king. This is a different Jehu, okay? But it says that the word of the Lord came unto him against Baasha, saying, For as much as I exalted thee out of the dust, and made thee prince over my people Israel, and thou hast walked in the way of Jeroboam, and hast made my people Israel to sin, to provoke me to anger with their sins, behold, I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and will make thy house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So notice how it's just like the same thing that he spoke, that was spoken against Jeroboam. It says, Him that dieth of Baasha in the city shall the dogs eat, and him that dieth of his in the field shall the fowls of the air eat. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah, and Elah his son reigned in his stead. And also by the hand of the prophet Jehu the son of Hanani came the word of the Lord against Baasha and against his house, even for all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, and provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, because he killed him. Now, what we see here with Baasha is the same thing that's happening to Jeroboam, and he does the same sins, the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. We also see, though, that there's a little bit of information here in verse 5 there. It says, Now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did and his might. So he was obviously a mighty king, okay? And obviously he was a man of war, right? He was building Ramah, and we kind of see that little bit of information there. You say, why isn't there a lot of information? Because he did evil in the sight of the Lord, so why would God put a whole bunch of information in there? But the one thing I wanted to point out here is it says, Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? This doesn't mean, so you may look at some of these places where it's like, well, is this not written in the Kings? Is this not written in the Chronicles? The Kings are more so, I would say this is more this is the book of the Kings of Israel. 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And then 1 and 2 Chronicles is the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. Okay? So when you go to Chronicles, you're actually not going to see much of anything about the Kings of Israel. So sometimes they'll be talking about a book that's not in the Bible. So don't get caught up on that and be like, well, that's not actually written in there. Because you'll see about Manasseh, he has his prayer where he's humbled before God. It says, is this not written in the Kings, in the book of the Kings of Judah? You won't find it in the Kings that were here in the Bible. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a book of the Kings of Judah where it was written. Okay, does that make sense? So when you look at this, don't get caught up on that when you're like, well, let's go over to Chronicles and see what it says about them, and then there's nothing mentioned about them. Okay, because what you have is really, we have 1st and 2nd Kings of Israel, and then you have the Chronicles of Judah. And that's a big reason why we have those two sets. Right? You may wonder to yourself, you're like, why is there the book of Kings, and then why is there the book of Chronicles? Why don't we just have one? Well, because one is focusing on Israel, and one's focusing on Judah. And that's actually probably a good thing, right? And so this is obviously focusing on Israel because you're going to see a whole bunch of information about Ahab. Elijah and Elisha were prophets in Israel, okay? You won't see them mentioned in the Chronicles. Why? Because it's focusing on Judah. So I just want to make that little commercial break there. When you're looking at these passages and you're like, well, let's see what it says here or in the Kings or in the Chronicles, and you don't see it, it's not a mistake in the Bible. It's just the fact that they're referencing another book of the Kings that's not Scripture. Okay? And so, that's something just to kind of keep in mind there. Now, King Elah, go to verse 8 there. You're in 1 Kings chapter 16. He's going to reign 2 years, and then he's going to be killed by Zimri, which is his servant. And so in 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 8, it says, "In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Elah, the son of Baasha, to reign over Israel in Tirzah 2 years. And his servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, steward of his house in Tirzah. And Zimri went in and smote him and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his stead." So his own servant kills him. So it all comes true, right? As far as with Ahijah the prophet, came true. As far as what's going to happen to Jeroboam and all his children. Then with Jehu, the son of Hanani, same thing. It all comes true, and we have Zimri taking him out. And what's interesting is, as far as this really shows us that Elah was just as wicked as his dad. Okay, because you may say, well, I kind of have sympathy for these sons that are just getting taken out as soon as they reign. But what you have to understand is that they're not innocent. So in verse 11 there, it goes on to say this. It says, "And it came to pass, when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he slew all the house of Baasha. He left him not one that pisseth against the wall, neither of his kinsfolks, nor of his friends. Thus did Zimri destroy all the house of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, by which they sinned, and by which they made Israel to sin, and provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel?" So notice how they. So in case you have some sympathy for Elah, he was right there in it with it. And same thing with Nadab. Nadab, I believe, was right there in it with his dad and these sins to provoke God to anger. And what's interesting about this provoking, it talks about this provocation. That term provocation is mentioned in the New Testament, talking about the children of Israel in the wilderness provoking the Lord to anger. When they made their golden calf, and he provoked them to anger, and he was grieved with them for 40 years. And so it's just history repeating itself. It's amazing. Like I said, when you get to Jeroboam and he's like, "Hey, these be thy gods, O Israel, that brought thee out of the land of Egypt," and you're like, what in the world? Like, you're quoting it. You're quoting what they did in the wilderness. You don't think that's a problem? And so you just see this history repeating itself. And you see, father, son. Same thing happened back to back here with Jeroboam and with Baasha and their sons. Both their sons. Same fate. And note also that Nadab, Baasha, and Elah, they all reigned during Asa. And we see that, during this year of Asa the king. Now, Asa reigned for a little while, so obviously that makes sense that they would reign, and all that for that long. They would be in that camp there. And both Nadab and Elah only reigned for 2 years, right? And so, that I know that's not a lot of information, dealing with these kings, but really there's not that much about them. It is interesting, though, that it says in verse 2 of chapter 16 about Baasha, the Lord is talking to Jehu and saying to say this unto Baasha. It says, "I exalted thee out of the dust and made thee prince over my people Israel." What's interesting about that, because you can kind of think about that with Jeroboam. God is the one that had Jeroboam take that kingdom. And he says, if you just follow me, I will make your house a sure house, just like David. And Baasha, I believe, would have been the same way. But again, what they choose? They chose the curse instead of the blessing. And, both their sons fall in suit, and they both are cut off at the very, very beginning there. And this is something that is just a theme throughout here, where it's, they start reigning, they're very evil, and then their sons reign, they're evil, and then that whole thing's cut off. With Judah, it's different. Judah, that line is unbroken, meaning that it's David's sons all the way through. There's no switch in families. We've already seen a switch in the family. So Jeroboam was of Ephraim, but then Baasha comes in of Issachar. So you have a change in family. Then Zimri is going to come in. Now Zimri is going to only reign for 7 days. Okay? So you better believe, well, I mean, I'm going to be talking about Zimri, but that's the shortest reign. You want some Bible trivia for you? That's it right there. What's the shortest reign of a king? 7 days. So that's why it talks about, he says, as soon as he sat on the throne, he took out all the seed of Baasha. That's because he only had that shorter period of time. He only had 7 days to do it. But, again, when you look at this, what you need to think about here is trying to remember these kings. You say, why does it matter? These guys are all evil. Well, you can always learn from their mistakes, first of all. But, when you're reading through here, when you're reading through the Kings and the Chronicles, it's good to just have a well understanding of, where you're at, right? If you're in the prophets, you're in Isaiah, you're talking about Hezekiah, then you know where you're at a little bit. Okay, well, I'm in Hezekiah, so that's this portion of history in the Kings. It's after this person, it's before this, right? It's after David, it's before Josiah. Be like, that should be known, but you can get it a little more honed in then. You can know who his dad is. You can know who his son is. You can know that Hezekiah's son is Manasseh, which is one of the most wicked kings in Judah. And just the things that you can learn from that. And so, but again, it's pretty easy. Saul reigned for 40 years over all